What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Always Compete Seahawks podcast. I am Sam. Today, we are going to be doing a head coaching search update for the Seahawks. It's been about 2 weeks since I made my last video talking about the Seahawks head coaching search and how that was going there. And now we are here to talk about, kind of um, how things are turning out now, how things are looking now that we are 2 weeks on. We are having some second week interviews that have happened this week, and we're going to be talking about that, discussing the landscape, where the Seahawks stand. Overall, for my first initial thoughts, I think this head coaching cycle has flowed better for the Seahawks than we could have possibly expected. You have a lot of coaches who have been hired that were never on the Seahawks radar, and that's a good thing. Like the if we're talking about teams that have hired coaches that were never on the Seahawks radar, we're talking about the Raiders hiring Antonio Pierce. He was their interim coach this year. The Patriots hiring Gerard Mayo. He was their linebackers coach. We can talk about the Titans hiring Brian Callahan. The Panthers hiring Dave Canales, by the way, former Seahawk coach. Congrats, Dave. Good luck in Carolina. I want to see him do well because there's not a lot of Seahawks assistants, former Seahawks assistants, that do very well. But yeah, I hope to see him do great. Good luck to him in Carolina with Bryce Young. And yeah, those five guys. Is that five? Am I tripping? I mean, I think so. I don't know. It's early in the morning. I'm not locked in. But yeah, so we're talking about these coaches being hired, and frankly, what we're seeing is a pretty good layout for the Seahawks going in. There's two head coaching jobs remaining on Saturday, January 27th, as of 11:06 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. There are two head coaching jobs remaining: the Seahawks and the Commanders. Really, the only coach that was hired that was on the Seahawks radar, yeah, Harbaugh to the Chargers. Stupid. Just remember that one. Harbaugh to the Chargers. Really, the only head coach that was on the Seahawks radar that got hired was Raheem Morris, who was the Rams defensive coordinator. He was actually set to interview yesterday, which was Friday, and the Falcons hired him before he could go to Seattle to do that interview. So that is really the only coach that was on the Seahawks radar. You guys knew from the video, I liked him a lot. Frankly, I'm not heartbroken that he's gone because of how this landscape has played out. Five of the six head coaches that were hired were never in consideration for the Seahawks, which is great news. It leaves the Seahawks a lot of room with just one other job available to take a step back, review the landscape, and take their time in finding the best coach, not having to rush it. The Seahawks are currently interviewing Ejiro Evero today. That is scheduled for Saturday. The Panthers DC. I like him a good amount. If you're on Seahawks Twitter, if you're on the Seahawks kind of fan base landscape, you know that there is not one clear vision for who is the best head coaching candidate. There are guys who think that Patrick Graham is a great candidate. There are some guys who think that Ejiro Evero is a terrible candidate. There are some guys who think that Mike Kafka is a decent candidate. There are a lot of differing perspectives on what you'll find among the Seahawks fan base, and there's not one clear answer as to who's the best. So it's gonna be very interesting to see where fans feel about this. As of this week, the Seahawks have interviewed on Tuesday. They interviewed Patrick Graham. On Wednesday, they interviewed Mike Kafka. On Thursday, they interviewed Dan Quinn. And these are all in person. Thursday, they interviewed Dan Quinn. Friday, they're set to interview Raheem Morris. However, Pete took the Atlanta job. That fell through. And now today, they're interviewing Ejiro Evero in person. So we are talking about a lot of head coaches coming through and interviewing for this job. However, there's seemingly this like idea that these guys are the finalists. Like these are like the five guys, or now I guess four guys that are like, okay, one of you guys is gonna get the job. That is not even close to the case, and it's very important to recognize that aspect. The Seahawks interviewed Ben Johnson, who they cannot interview this week because he is in person. Typically, for people that are not really aware, typically the second interviews are in person. They are in the team building. You cannot fly out Ben Johnson the week he plays in the NFC Conference Championship game to Seattle. I imagine that they want to wait for that, and I think that they are feeling the pulse and know that they can wait for that. They know that they can take that time to get that interview with Ben Johnson, especially if they believe that he is interested in this job. And we're looking at Other coaches that might be in consideration. We're talking about Mike McDonald, the Ravens DC, who there was early reported interest in, but ever since then it's fallen radio silent. There was some buzz this week around Mike McDonald coming to Seattle, and there was some reasons why maybe they didn't interview him right away. For instance, when they fired Pete Carroll, they had to have their coaching interviews in by a certain time for teams that were on a bye. They did not get those interview requests in from Mike McDonald in time to interview him. However, maybe the interest is there, and maybe they know that they want him. They just haven't had that chance to interview him. Frankly, I think the Seahawks are hoping, praying that the Lions and Ravens lose tomorrow. They want those teams to lose so that they can get those candidates out and available to interview and get a better look at this landscape. Frankly, there's some buzz from Albert Breer, who said that the sense around league circles is that the Seahawks do have interest in Mike McDonald, and it's not that he is just not going to be interviewed at all. I think, frankly, how could you not interview Mike McDonald after he shut down the Niners, after he shut down other great teams, the Rams, after he shut down the Dolphins? We're talking about really, really good offenses that the Seahawks have not been able to stop. You go out and you get a guy like that, you're talking about serious changes being made on this team. I think Mike McDonald is going to end up being interviewed. I think that he's going to end up being a finalist, especially in my opinion, this is what is going to happen. I think that the Commanders are going to end up hiring Ben Johnson as their head coach sometime next week. That's just my gut sense. I can't say that for sure, but I say that pretty confidently. I'll say that with like a 75% confidence that I think Ben Johnson by the end of next week is hired as the Commanders head coach. And I think that's a reasonable saying. It's a reasonable thing from what everybody's saying, that the Commanders, they like him. He's interested in that job. He likes the fact they have the second overall pick. He likes the fact he can go out and get a quarterback. That's a big factor for him. And I'm sure that in general, he's going to be more interested in that job to get a quarterback that he can work with. But let's say hypothetically he is interested in Seattle. I think that the Seahawks might not offer him the job right away as fast as the Commanders will, and then he'll have to change his mind on that. I think the Commanders are going to hire their head coach sometime next week, whether it's Dan Quinn, which you've heard some buzz about. They're interviewing him for a second time in person early next week. And then we're also going to be talking about, Ben Johnson coming back in likely for another interview. That's the spot where everybody says he's getting the most interest. I think it makes the most sense that Ben Johnson is going to head out and likely be the coach of Washington. That leaves Seattle in the place where they have no other head coaching openings, and they can take a look at, everything that is happening, everything that's unfolding. They're going to be able to sit back, take a step back and say, okay, we have Mike McDonald still available. We have Mike Vrabel still available. We have all these other coaching candidates that we interviewed still available. Ejiro Evero, Patrick Graham, Dan Quinn, those guys that they already interviewed still available. They're probably going to have Bobby Slowick still available if they want to interview him again. The overall point that I'm trying to make is that the Seahawks are in a great place where they can be patient and really take time to make the best hire, and they are going to have great candidates available. It's not like they're picking bargain bin with these candidates here. It's not like they're like, oh, everybody got hired, we have to go get Mike Kafka from the Giants. That is not necessarily the case. They are going to have the ability to take some time, look at the landscape of this and say, you know what? Yeah, let's take some time. Let's go interview Mike McDonald. We can interview him twice, 3 times if we want to, because no one else is going to be rushing to hire him. You can talk about wanting to maybe go take a look at Dan Quinn again, who frankly, I think is going to be one of the top 3 finalists for this job. I think when all is said and done, there's some buzz from Jeremy Fowler that Dan Quinn was in Seattle until late Thursday night when he was interviewing. He was there throughout the night talking with the heads of the team. That makes a lot of sense. Dan Quinn makes a ton of sense, and frankly, I think Seattle fans are letting 1 or 2 games define Dan Quinn a bit too much, and it's frustrating because teams have games where they don't show up, and we cannot simply look at and judge coaches by one bad game. We cannot say that Kyle Shanahan is a bad offensive coach because the Ravens own him. We cannot say that he's a bad offensive coach because the Browns owned him. It would be stupid to say that. We need to be able to realistically step back and look at a full landscape of a season, look at a full scope and really acknowledge that Dan Quinn is very well liked by the players. He calls plays on defense for that Dallas team. And ultimately, he is working with a defense that was great throughout all last year. I mean, besides for a few examples, but we need to acknowledge that that happens with every single NFL team. It would be stupid to look at one performance and say, "Oh, this guy sucks because he allowed this much points to this team and this much points to another team." It would be foolish to acknowledge that. It would be foolish to look at that. And I think it's important to also take a look at who the Seahawks are interviewing. They are interviewing defensive guys, and that is important to know. If we're looking at points per game, the Ravens defense far and away the most dominant defense in football. As it goes for what we are seeing from these teams. Far and away the most dominant defense in football. Trying to pull up the stats here. I'm trying to see if I can get the good numbers here. If I can find this, if NFL.com will load. Okay. Scoring defenses by team. So this is just not working out the way I want it to, but yeah, I think that these defenses are they're important to gauge from a a single game perspective and look at a whole year of games. As far as defensive coaches that the Seahawks have interviewed, they've interviewed Dan Quinn. The Cowboys, we were fifth in scoring defense allowed per game, 18 and a half points a game. We're talking about, a defense that was dominant throughout the whole year. And it's important to note that in spite of those games where maybe they got blown out, maybe they allowed so and so points, they were still top five. And that kind of speaks to the consistency and the overall dominance that this defense played with throughout the entire stretch of the season. And then you look at the Raiders. A lot of people are talking about why would you interview Patrick Graham? He's the Raiders DC. And maybe I was like that first, but those are kind of my first looks. And frankly, I have taken some time to really analyze the coaches and the candidates that we are seeing. The Raiders defense finished the year extremely strong. They were ninth to finish the year, 19 and a half points a game roughly allowed on scoring defense. Ejiro Evero and the Panthers are pretty low down there. But if you also look at their yards per game, they were right up there, which kind of speaks to the fact that maybe if Carolina had a better defense, maybe if Carolina had a better offense, they would allow less points. It kind of speaks to the idea that they're going for it or they're turning the ball over. And because these teams are having to get less yards, they're scoring more often because they're fourth in yards allowed per game. They're ahead of the Niners. They're ahead of the Bills. They're ahead of the Saints. They're ahead of, the Ravens are ahead of the Cowboys. These are top tier defenses. It kind of suggests that maybe this defense was struggling based on the fact that their offense was so terrible. And you can also take a step back to last year. Look at last year's regular season. How did these defenses perform when it came to that? Look at points per game. Niners defense was the best. D'Amico Ryans got hired. Cowboys, once again, fifth best defense by points allowed per game. That's important. That's an important note to take in. The Ejiro Evero and the Broncos defense was about middle of the pack. Right in there, kind of in like the high teens. And then, you're talking about the Raiders being pretty low down, with Patrick Graham. All in all, my key takeaway is that the Seahawks are in a great spot. If I had to place my likelihood chances on coaches being hired, I think that Dan Quinn probably has the best chance, and that's just my gut feeling. It's the fact that he interviewed for so long. It's the fact that he's been rumored there since day one. Is that saying that the Seahawks are defaulting to Dan Quinn? No, I think Dan Quinn has about a 20% chance of being the Seahawks head coach. Maybe a 25% chance, which I think is probably the highest. I mean, maybe I would even bump it up to 30. And then, we're kind of talking about everyone else kind of having that big question mark. Do the Seahawks want to go with the status quo of the Seahawks and say, who cares if they don't say this guy's the right candidate for us? He's who we think is best. And sometimes that works out really well for the Seahawks. Sometimes that works out really bad for the Seahawks. We have to see where that goes. Or do the Seahawks kind of say, the fans want Ben Johnson? You know what? We're going to go get them Ben Johnson. And also, it's important to know what Jody Allen wants. Jody Allen is not a football person necessarily. She is going to want someone who is going to excite the fan base, is going to ignite the fans and be exciting to the team. She's going to want an offensive coach. We are going to see where that develops and how that plays out. Overall, if I had to give my idea on how next week will look, the Seahawks will probably bring back 2 or 3 of the candidates that they interviewed this week. And then also probably bring in Ben Johnson, given the fact, the prediction that they lose to the Niners, probably bring in Ben Johnson, probably bring in Mike McDonald if the Ravens lose. That is the landscape that we're going to be looking at here. In my opinion, frankly, I think this is working out really well for the Seahawks, and I don't think that there are many ways they could blow it unless they go out and hire Mike Kafka with all these guys. That would be a nightmare scenario. But interviewing Ejiro Evero today, interested to see where that goes. If things were my ideal world, the coaching candidates that they would bring back for next week would be Dan Quinn and Ejiro Evero. And then they would also interview Ben Johnson if he is available to be interviewed. That is my ideal world. And then the Seahawks got to take a look, step back and say who is the best coach for this scenario and make the decision from there. That's really all I have to say. That's kind of my update, my thoughts, just kind of rambling, not a ton of stuff to really talk about. I'm looking forward to them hopefully hiring a coach within the next week or two and really starting to talk about the staff being put together and looking towards free agency. That's really all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe, hit that like, ring that notification bell for whenever we upload. We're going to be uploading, especially at this point in the season, once or twice every week or two, just to, kind of, there's not a lot going on for the Seahawks. I'm sorry. There's not much to cover. But once we get to free agency, we get into mid-February, late February, early March, and then the staff starts to get put together and the team is ready to go to get into free agency. Then we'll start doing some prediction videos. I'm looking forward to that. So stay tuned. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Who do you think is the best Seahawks head coaching candidate that they could go for? Who do you think is the strongest guy for the job? And who do you want the Seahawks to go for by the end of the day? And just give your thoughts on the candidates in general. I'm Sam. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.